David Cameron, welcome to 7:30.
Great to be with you.
The UK and Australia have signed a treaty committing to consult when either country is under threat. What circumstances could trigger this?
Well, I think it could be a lot of different things. We're also looking particularly at if there are disasters in our region and how we work with each other on a consular basis. So what we see with Britain or Australia is the relationship is getting deeper and more substantial all the time. Obviously with AUKUS, obviously with the free trade deal, both of us in CP, TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership and the agreements we've made today.
Now, your Defence Minister Grant Shapps said that we're moving from a post-war world to a pre-war world. Do you agree?
Well, we're certainly living in a more dangerous world. We've not only got the situation in Europe with Putin's illegal invasion of Ukraine, which have consequences all over the world. We've also got the crisis with Israel and Gaza. More wars in Africa than we've had for 40 years. The situation in Myanmar. Wherever you look in the world, as I've said, the lights on the global dashboard are flashing red. And so it is a much more dangerous, difficult, uncertain world. And so even more need for friendly countries, friendly democracies that share so much history and culture and values like Britain and Australia to work so closely together.
Let me ask you about this region. Does the UK regard China's rapid military build-up as a serious threat to global security?
We see China's approach today as a epoch-defining challenge. We want to engage with China where we can and where it's mutually beneficial on things like climate change. But clearly, there are some very challenging aspects to their behaviour in Hong Kong when it comes to the Uyghurs, the treatment of Australia in recent years. We are seeing a much more assertive China. And again, this only underlines the need for Britain and Australia and like-minded partners to work together.
To be specific, do you regard a Chinese invasion or a blockade of Taiwan as a genuine threat?
Well, it is clearly something we're very concerned about. We don't want to see any unilateral action to change the situation between China and Taiwan. And there's no doubt that were there to be something like a blockade, it would have an absolutely calamitous effect on not just on Taiwan, but on the global economy. We've had recent evidence of a calamitous event with COVID, and I think if that were to happen with Taiwan, it would be more significant.
But I guess what I'm asking is that possibility of an invasion or a blockade, how big a danger does that face right now, a situation that changes the reality of the world in the same way that the invasion of Ukraine did?
Well, clearly, this is not something we want to see happen. We don't believe it should happen. We've heard China say many times that their approach on One China is something that should happen peacefully.
They've also spoken, frankly, about being on a path to reunification with Taiwan.
Absolutely, which is why it's very important to say that we don't support unilateral action. It's very important to say how we're going to work with partners to try and avert these dangers. And it's very important to say to non-aligned countries that, of course, you are non-aligned, but it doesn't mean you wouldn't be affected by this happening. You'd be affected very, very badly, and it's important that countries are clear about that.
Where does the UK fit into that? I mean, why would the UK send its stretched military assets thousands of miles away to the South China Sea or the East China Sea?
Well, we have a presence in the Indo-Pacific. We have the offshore patrol vessels. We have the AUKUS agreement with Australia and America, which I think is very significant. We do this not because of some sort of delusions of empire grandeur. We do it because the Indo-Pacific is vital for the world's prosperity and for our prosperity, and it's also vital for our security. Problems that start in Europe don't end in Europe. Problems that start in the Indo-Pacific don't end in the Indo-Pacific.
You just raised AUKUS. We know, as I said before, that China is developing its military capacity at an astonishing pace. How can the AUKUS submarine program, with its long delivery times, compete?
Well, I think what AUKUS is a pact that brings three countries that are highly capable together and says we're going to invest in our security, we're going to invest in defence assets, invest in intelligence assets, and we're going to work together on future capabilities as well. Defence is all about being prepared to spend the money so that you can react to any eventuality, and you can deter those things that you are concerned about.
And yet, as of today, we don't know exactly how much the UK is going to spend on AUKUS, do we? They haven't made those figures public.
Well, what we've said is we are going to build a whole new generation of nuclear-powered but conventionally armed submarines. These will be replacing the Astute class that we have in the UK that have been highly effective, that do give us a great defence reach and capability around the world.
These
and
are,
it's very
if I may
important that we
interrupt
do
you,
that.
these are pledges, and you know from your time leading the country that what matters equally, if not more so, is where the money is committed. So how much money is the UK going to commit?
We will commit the necessary money to build the submarines, and we have in Barrow-in-Furness in the UK an incredible facility for building submarines. We built and launched, I think, 8 of the Astute-class submarines while I was Prime Minister, so I'm very aware of what the costs are and what is necessary.
And the delays.
And potentially, but that's why, in our cabinet system at the moment, we are meeting regularly to make sure that everything that needs to be done to build those submarines is done, including investing in the local community and making sure the skills are there, making sure the people are there. It's going to be a huge national operation, but we're now sharing it, as it were, with the United States and Australia.
How much do you expect Australia to contribute to that programme?
I'm not going to go into the numbers, but I know that what's really good about being here this week is seeing what cross-party agreement there is on AUKUS. This is not something that's going to be traded one way or traded the other way. Australia has rightly, in my view, bought into this idea. So has Britain, so has America, and will spend what's necessary to deliver the submarines.
So Australia shouldn't be concerned about existing delays and problems in the military-industrial complex in the UK?
No. We all, look, you always have to think, are we going to get this done? Are we going to get it done in time? Have we got the resources? But I'm happy from where I sit that I know in the UK system, we know where we're going to build them, we know what we're going to build, we know how much it's going to cost, we're absolutely committed to doing it.
I want to ask you about Donald Trump, and when people can, make light of what Trump does, and indeed you're smiling and I understand why, but at the same time you were critical of Donald Trump's comments that the US would not fund NATO countries who didn't spend enough on defence. That was a serious point. Do you trust him to maintain commitments on AUKUS were he to be elected?
Well, I think what we saw in his recent interview was a clarification, as it were, that he does support NATO and that he wants, obviously, European countries to spend more on defence. And that's one thing I agree with Donald Trump about. European countries do need to spend more on defence.
Doesn't the UK need to as well increase its...
Well, I set in, when I was Prime Minister, I set at the Cardiff NATO conference the 2% target and said we've all got to reach that 2%. Britain has never gone below 2%. We're now getting up to 2.25. It's other countries that need to do more, but all of us over time, as our Prime Minister has said, are going to have to raise those defence budgets.
Including the UK?
Yeah.
Yeah. I want to ask you about the Middle East. What should the UK do if the Netanyahu government proceeds with an assault on Rafah, where we know that so many civilians who were forced out of other parts of Gaza are taking refuge?
Well, first of all, we're in the situation today where we're messaging very clearly to say that you should not go ahead with that offensive unless you have a plan for how to protect civilians. That plan doesn't exist at the moment. There needs to be that plan before we could see that going ahead.
But what happens if he ignores that message?
Well, I hope that he won't, because I think that it's hard to see how you could carry out an offensive in Rafah without having a clear plan that's going to avoid an appalling level of civilian casualties. So that plan needs to be put in place. But look, let's take a step back and hope that we can actually get the pause in the fighting with the hostage deal between Israel and Hamas that will bring about 40 released hostages, or hopefully more, and a delay in the fight, a stop in the fighting, which we can then build the momentum to try and make that pause a permanent, sustained ceasefire by changing the conditions that exist on the ground. That must be the aim.
If, however, they proceed, is there a circumstance where the UK would suspend its export licences to Israel?
Well, obviously what we've said is that Israel has a right to defend itself, but it has to act in accordance with international humanitarian law. That's something that we keep properly under review, and if that weren't to happen, then obviously there would be consequences of that.
What would those consequences be?
Well, the process is that we have to look at whether they are capable and whether they are committed and whether they are compliant, and that's something we have to look at, which informs our export licensing decisions.
Is there any way in which there could be an assault on Rafah and international law be
I think
maintained?
you're asking too many conditionals there.
All right, let me ask you this question. As well as the catastrophic loss of life, what we've seen in recent days are new images and new stories of, particularly of the suffering and malnourishment and even deaths of children. What do you think when you see those images?
Well, they're horrific images that we've seen of particularly children suffering, and we're beginning to see people, as you say, who are dying because they're hungry and there's starvation. So it's desperate to get the extra aid in. Now, I think to be fair to the Israelis, you can see that in recent days, certainly the message has changed. They're talking about flooding Gaza with aid. That isn't something they said before. The number of trucks that are going in March so far is radically up on the very low number in February. And obviously they're opening this maritime corridor, which is important, getting aid from Cyprus into Gaza. One of the things that I'd say about the maritime corridor, it's a good idea, but they should open the port in Ashdod. It's a working port in Israel. They could get really huge amounts of aid through that port and into Gaza, and I'd urge them to do that now.
Do you think that the UK has lost the capacity to influence the Netanyahu government?
I don't, actually. I think that some of the things that we have said, alongside the Americans and others, I hope have had an effect. It saw the opening of the Kerem Shalom crossing. It's seen the move on the maritime corridor and this statement about flooding Gaza with aid. I want to see that happen. Words aren't enough, but that's a welcome change. You
said recently that recognition of a Palestinian state should be part of the unstoppable momentum towards a two-state solution once the leaders of Hamas had left Gaza. If that condition could be met, would the UK recognise Palestine against the wishes of Israel?
Well, what I've said is that, well, certainly Israel shouldn't have a veto over this issue. The long-standing British position has been that recognition comes when it most benefits a peace process and a two-state solution. What I've said is that it shouldn't come at the start of the process, because I don't want to let quite a lot of work the Palestinian Authority have to do to reform and deal with the issues that they face, but it shouldn't come at the end of the process. So that's why we're saying is it could be part of this unstoppable momentum that we do need to see. To separate, in many ways, it's to separate the Palestinian people from Hamas. Hamas don't want a two-state solution. They want a one-state solution, a no-Israel solution. But ordinary Palestinian people, I think, do deserve the dignity and security that comes from statehood.
I just want to ask you a question about Julian Assange, back to a micro question. There are reports overnight of a possible resolution in Assange's case, which would see him plead guilty to a lesser charge and avoid prison time. Is that what you think will happen?
I can't comment on that. There is a legal process underway for his extradition to the United States, and we have to let that legal process take its course.
Do you agree with our Prime Minister, Anthony Albanese, that in relation to Julian Assange, enough is enough?
Well, I would like to see this happen. I think that our legal processes do take time, and it's important we have to go through all those important stages, but it would be good if we could see this resolved.
You don't want to see him extradited to the US?
No, I think there are legal processes that need to be gone through. I think, part of this is because Assange himself decided to camp in the Ecuadorian embassy for years on end. That was unnecessary. He should have faced his accusers earlier, in my view.
Let me just ask you a question about Brexit. There's enormous interest in Australia about it, of course, and your legacy as Prime Minister is defined by the Brexit referendum and Britain's exit from Europe. It might not feel like that from your point of view, but for the rest of the world. The leader of the Liberal Democrats, I saw, has pledged to set the UK on a path back to the EU single market. Is that what political courage in the UK looks like now?
Well, I think the right thing to do in a democracy, when you make a promise, as I did, I promised to hold a referendum. I did that 2 years before the general election. We put it in our manifesto. We won that election. We held the referendum. The result was not what I wanted. My side of the campaign lost. But as a good Democrat, I accepted the result of that. I've now returned to government many years later, and one of the things I want to do is make sure that we make the new arrangements work. And I'm happy to say that we're doing that. We're proving that we can be a good friend and good neighbour and good partner to the EU, but not a member. And that's what we're doing. And I think Ukraine, in many ways, demonstrates how that's working. Britain is probably the leading European assister assistant of Ukraine, and we're doing that alongside
I think
Germany
disputes that position on the grid, but anyway, it's clearly a major contribution.
It's a major. If you ask the Ukrainians, I went there and they said, "You really are our number one partner," and I was very pleased to hear that. But if you take the situation with Australia, since Brexit, we've been able to do this trade deal with Australia, and that means
it's not what you wanted, though, is it?
Well, but you have to make work the arrangements we have, but to give your viewers a tangible example of what that means young Australians under the age of 35 can come and work in my country in Britain for 3 years, work and live, and Britons can come and do that in Australia, and that's exactly the sort of ties that two like-minded countries that are friends on the other side of the world should be able to do.
David Cameron, thank you very much. At least you're here and not in the UK where they're carrying on with their leadership shenanigans. Thank you very much indeed for joining 7:30.